After denuclearization talks between the DPRK and the U.S. stalled last year, South Korean President Moon Jae-in is pushing for a new Trump-Kim summit before November's U.S. presidential elections. With the DPRK refusing a new round of talks and U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Stephen Biegun hinting that a summit may not happen, what is the future for Korean denuclearization? Is the DPRK waiting to see what the U.S. elections will bring about? And without a clear plan for either country, how can substantial discussion happen? To talk about these issues, I'm joined by Jack Barton, our correspondent in Seoul, Jenny Town, research analyst at the Stimson Center and the managing editor of 38 North, and Michael O'Hanlon, senior fellow from Brookings Institution. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Joe. Let me start with you, Jack. It has been 6 months since talks between the U.S. and the DPRK broke down, but it seems South Korea is right now eager to reinitiate a new round of talks. Why?
Because it has been something that President Moon has been pressing for even before he became president. And for the president, it really does seem to be something he personally believes in. It's not just a piece of policy. It's personal for him, of course. His parents fled the North during the war. He himself is the son of refugees. He, unlike many other political leaders, he didn't dodge the draft here. And not only that, he volunteered for the special forces and served at the demilitarized zone during one of the periods of the greatest tensions, where many people thought it might even spark a third world war. So he's very personally invested in this. He's not just hoping for a greater peace, but all along he's been hoping for a real breakthrough, leading to the demilitarization, the real demilitarization of the demilitarized zone, but also much closer economic cooperation. I know they can't bring the two Koreas back together in the short term, but Moon really wants to normalize relations as much as possible in the last few years of his term. But at the moment, given the impasse that we've seen, and it's some would say that the talks really broke down after the first summit between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, because really nothing came of it. Nothing really has ever since. It's going to be very difficult to get real momentum that might achieve anything in that 2 years.
Although President Moon is probably eager to restart the talks, he hasn't heard any encouraging words or seen signs from either U.S. and DPRK, considering the fact that the North just demolished an empty South Korean liaison office. What does President Moon think of the reactions from the North? Again,
all we hear is words of optimism, but there's no doubt they're dismayed here. That's why we've seen President Moon recently reshuffle his national security team, putting a few people with real hands-on experience, not just recent experience, but experience over decades, in charge of trying to get those talks going. But it really needs something substantial for Pyongyang to respond. Everybody knows that here. I mean, the main problem is the DPRK really wants major sanctions relief and security guarantees, but really substantial sanctions relief. In return for that, the U.S. is talking about total nuclear disarmament, and it all happening before sanctions get lifted. Is that kind of an impasse? What Pyongyang is wanting is a little bit of this for a little bit of that. So we'll give up a bit of this, you give us some sanctions relief. The big problem really seems to be, this sort of all or nothing approach. That is the problem right now. Unless Pyongyang gets something, it's very difficult to see this diplomacy going forward. President Moon has promised a lot to the DPRK in terms of a big rail infrastructure project, getting the joint industrial area going again, tourism. The problem is the sanctions are in the way. He really hoped he could twist Donald Trump's arm to get him to relieve those sanctions so that, relations could warm and it would lead to a bigger diplomacy. But it hasn't happened, and it's, maybe Stephen Biegun's going to deliver a big surprise on this visit, that might be being considered, but we certainly haven't heard anything about that yet.
But that's probably the reason why the previous 2 rounds haven't worked out, and why he's insistent on pushing for talks before the November election in the U.S. Does he considering the option that maybe President Trump will not be voted in, and that will be even more problematic?
It could be more problematic, but it depends where it goes. Without any doubt, the perception here is that the meetings between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump haven't really had any substance, and a part of that, at least the perception, is that it's been Donald Trump really sort of parading around for the domestic audience. So it hasn't really been much to do with getting genuine diplomacy off the ground, more than it has as, hey, I'm the guy that can come and do a deal, and look, I've done stuff that nobody's done before. Particularly in the last meeting we saw at the DMZ, where we could see a look of sort of chagrin on Kim Jong-un's face as he walked away, really realizing that he'd been duped again into sort of a photo op at the DMZ for the sake of the U.S. domestic audience. That's why, at least amongst the analysts here, the perception is that they've dug in, and unless there's substance on the table, unless it, Stephen Biegun or somebody else comes down and says, this is what we're prepared to give you, then the talks won't go forward. And without traction in the U.S. Talks in the DPRK, it's going to be difficult to get traction in the talks between Seoul and Pyongyang.
Exactly. As you said, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Stephen Biegun is on a visit to South Korea and Japan to talk about the START negotiations. So Jenny, he hasn't said he expects face-to-face talks before the upcoming elections because of the pandemic. Will Biegun's visit mean anything substantial for negotiations?
I highly doubt it. It's really hard to say, though. From what I understand of the meetings, the mood in Seoul is that there's not anything going on. They certainly are in a very difficult place right now where they want to gain some momentum. I think it's less about the election and more of just they don't know what else to do. They don't want the situation to devolve. They don't want to lose the ground that they've already gotten. They don't want to go back to 2017. And with North Korea's reactions over the last couple of months and for the last few months of resumed missile testing, especially short-range and tactical weapons, that's the situation they're trying to avoid. And so they keep coming back overly optimistic. They keep pushing and pulling on the U.S. To make a move. But unfortunately, the U.S. is very distracted right now with other domestic issues. And it's hard to imagine a situation where the U.S. is going to drastically change its position in order to get North Korea to come back to the table.
And how easy will Seoul be, and what kind of messages Biegun can bring to South Koreans about the dilemma that they're in?
Well, hopefully it's a message of, one, solidarity, that they do understand that they are still working on it, they are still committed to it. Even, right now we're at a situation where the North Koreans are unwilling to come back. Just for talks, and especially if there isn't some signaling that there is an offer and that the offer is different. So, I think they are also trying to figure out what to do with the bilateral working group that's been going on between the U.S. and South Korea since it was built around the concept of facilitating inter-Korean cooperation. And so now that there isn't inter-Korean cooperation, it's become somewhat of a sore spot and somewhat of a burden in that process. So I think they're still trying to figure out those bilateral dynamics and how they can still continue to cooperate on North Korea.
And another reason that probably won't happen is that the messages from the North. We've heard some words from the North saying that the DPRK is in no mood talking to the U.S. right now because they're not serious about negotiations. Are North Koreans serious about not continuing the talks?
I think the North Koreans are serious about wanting to hear something different. And so as long as the rhetoric in the U.S. stays the same, the public messaging stays the same, if there are private messages being passed along, as long as it's still, let's just have talks, and again, not an offer and not something tangible that they have a sense that coming back will lead to a different result. I think right now they're very unwilling for that photo op again and to take that chance to come back and again walk away empty-handed.
And Jack, do you think South Korea can offer something in return for the North to be more calmed about the prospects of talks and inter-Korean relations?
The problem for South Korea really just is the sanctions. South Korea has already put a lot on the table, and North Korea has shown that it is interested in what the South has to offer. That's a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure upgrade. Again, reopening the industrial zone and perhaps expanding industrial zones, certainly expanding economic activity and de-escalating those tensions along the DMZ and working towards a peace agreement that would finally end the Korean War, which is still technically ongoing. All of that is appealing to Pyongyang, or at least that's the messages they've put out. The problem is President Moon has had many phone conversations and meetings with President Trump, trying to convince him to get on board, at least easing or making loopholes through some of those sanctions so that the DPRK and South Korea can engage and sort of build up some momentum. But every time he's tried that, it's fallen on deaf ears. He's really had no headway there at all. So there's a lot on offer. He's put a lot on the table. Pyongyang has been receptive to that. The problem is it just can't happen, not under the current sort of circumstances.
So
anyway.
President Moon is facing pressure both from the DPRK in the north and the United States across the Pacific. If there's anything that the South Koreans can do to satisfy both demands?
Not really. Again, as you know, we just heard, it's really a matter of what do we do. They're caught at the crossroads at the moment. President Moon doesn't really know how to move forward. A lot of things have failed. There is a public perception here that, things are not going well, particularly after that liaison office was blown up just north of the DMZ. It had only been put up a few years ago. Millions of dollars have been put into it, and of course that's not what the public wants to see here. But again, this is something, it's very personal to President Moon Jae-in. He hasn't wavered on it, and as we've seen with this reshuffle of the national security team, he's going to keep trying and keep trying until he gets a breakthrough, or at least trying to get that breakthrough.
And Jenny, do you think North Koreans are actually waiting for the results of the presidential election in the U.S.? Hopefully, I don't know whether it is their hope or not, but Joe Biden will become president. It will have new things coming up, and that's what North Koreans are betting on.
Well, I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. I don't think the North Koreans have a very optimistic outlook on what a Biden administration's North Korea policy would look like, especially since their relationship with the Obama administration was not good. That was the era of strategic patience. They were very frustrated with the lack of communication and the lack of political will to negotiate. I do think,
So they think Biden will ignore DPRK as Obama did?
Maybe not necessarily ignore, but may return back to a more hardline stance, may return back to a position where North Korea has to make the first move in order to prove that they're serious about negotiations. This was sort of the Obama administration mantra, was that they had to show their sincerity first, which is not necessarily ignoring, but is not facilitating active dialogue as well. And so I think they probably consider this opportunity where, Trump and Kim have made a relationship, probably won't have that same opportunity under a Biden administration, given what the Obama administration was in the past.
If there was so much uncertainties, there was a change of hands in government in D.C., why don't the North Koreans use this precious time, 6 months left, to talk to Trump again and accept the offer to restart the negotiation?
Well, I think there is a credibility issue, just as they don't believe the South Koreans can move forward because the South Koreans haven't been able to move forward over the past 2 years. I don't think they believe that the Trump administration right now has a different offer to put on the table. And there's a credibility factor where if Trump doesn't win this election and they rush through and try and get an agreement before the election happens, what kind of credibility is there that this this deal would last beyond a political transition, and they've seen this happen in the past as well. So I think, you know, if you look at Kim Jong-un's December speech to the party plenum at the end of the year, there was this indication where they didn't necessarily believe that changing the external environment was going to bring them economic gains, and especially not in the near future. And I think right now they're really working on building up those domestic institutions and domestic processes to better withstand a continued hostile relationship. And, you know, getting back to negotiations when it makes sense and when there's something different on the table.
That's probably the reading of North Koreans right now. And Jack, following the demolition of the liaison office, the DPRK said it would be sending troops to the demilitarized zone on the border. And Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, said South Korea was a, quote, U.S. puppet for not pushing for better ties, despite U.S. pressure. So how hostile have two Koreas become recently?
Well, there was a lot of worry when those threats were made, but then all of a sudden, Kim Jong-un, Kim Yo-jong, they just went silent on the matter, and all of that seemed to go away, and there was no real reason given as to why that was, and it's still a mystery here. But that didn't play out, and so we haven't seen that escalation at the demilitarized zone, and the perception here, again, it's just posturing. And you know, again, North Korea is saying we don't want to have negotiations with Washington, but of course you would say that if you wanted negotiations and you wanted to go in with a stronger hand. We've seen that with the missile tests recently, the spate of missile tests. That didn't work, so there's tough talk. Clearly Pyongyang does want something. They don't want no negotiations, but it's what do we have to say to get something substantial on the table? That's certainly the reading of what's going on here, and perhaps that recent posturing about building up military tensions again was part of that. But before anyone could react, that just sort of all went away.
But is that just the bluffing, or they were really sent some military personnel to the border area? Because that has been quiet for quite some time.
Yeah, it has been quiet for quite some time. I spoke to some intelligence officials, and they did say there was some movement of troops, there was something of a build-up, but nothing that would pose a great existential threat to South Korea or cause a big rethink of policy. And again, you know, no sooner had that threat been made before even a major response or even a tactical response could be formulated, it just seemed to go away again. So it did seem to be, at least from what we can read of that, we don't know exactly what's going on in the thinking over there, but from what we can read of it, it did seem to be a bluff. It did seem to be just another attempt at a pressure tactic to achieve some goal in this, what is very much long-term diplomacy at the moment.
And have militarily, have South Koreans made any preparations or action moves in response or in coordination with the U.S.?
Well, South Korea, President Moon, he's been seeking peace and economic cooperation with North Korea, but he's also seen one of the biggest build-ups of the military under any president here, a big boost in the spending since he's come to office. They've set up something called the kill chain, which is the anti-missile defense systems, but also big upgrades. They're talking about building nuclear submarines that could theoretically be capable of carrying nuclear missiles one day. There's no plans for them to do so at the moment, and yeah, very much so the policy really has been to try as hard as possible for peace, but to ensure that South Korea is militarily ready for a real war. But you know, the other aim there is to ultimately take over all operations from the US, because the US, in a time of war, still have command of South Korean forces, and there is a plan for that to change. But for that to happen, South Korea has to be fully prepared to go it alone, and that's why President Moon has put so much money and a big reshuffle into the military, really changing the command structure as well.
And since the summit in Singapore, no clear plan has been suggested by either nation regarding denuclearization, but also neither anything substantial happened on either side to provoke each other. For example, no more sanctions from U.S. and South Korea, and no more nuclear and long-range missile tests. Will that change?
It's hard to see at this point. The one thing that Kim Jong-un has really refrained from is long-range missile tests and resuming nuclear tests again. But perhaps, as you mentioned, it could be a wait and see until there's a new leadership. We also don't know what pressure they're under at the moment, because there's no doubt that the COVID-19 pandemic has really caused economic pain in that country in the way that sanctions probably haven't managed to achieve, by really closing off the borders and really cutting trade with China as well. So we don't know exactly what the situation is, but we know that it must be fairly tough. And certainly, there would be a desire to go out and get the diplomacy rolling again. But again, something Jenny mentioned before, coming back to the pandemic, everybody's attention is on that and on the economic fallout from the pandemic that will flow through into 2021. So what seemed like a big crisis back in 2017, or the biggest story, the biggest flashpoint, has really gone onto the back burner. And perhaps that's one of the biggest problems of all here in trying to get this diplomacy again, is in terms of priority, it's just not ranking very high on the global radar at the moment.
And also, Jack, tomorrow will be a major anniversary, the 25th anniversary of the passing of his grandfather, Kim Jong-un's grandfather. But last time he didn't show up at an anniversary. A lot of speculations about his health. So do you think there might be some speculations this time in making wrong readings about his whereabouts?
Well, we'll all have to wait and see if he turns up. I mean, one of the other theories is that because of COVID-19, he was just sort of keeping out of the limelight, trying not to catch the virus, as probably many other officials did, and that could be another reason to explain the disappearance. He has been popping up again a little bit more regularly, though still keeping a lower profile. But again, we're going to have to wait and see whether or not he turns up before we can start giving interpretations on it.
Yeah. And Michael, what do you make of North Korean leaders' plan to sometimes showing up, sometimes not showing up, and give the world a hard time guessing what has happened?
Well, there are probably a couple dimensions to this. As we know, a few years ago, we learned of a U.S. ROK war plan that would actually envision targeting North Korean leader early in a conflict. And certainly Kim Jong-un would have taken notice of that. He would probably also remember that when the United States-led coalition invaded Iraq in 2003, our opening attempt was to try to kill Saddam Hussein at his farm outside of Baghdad. We missed, but we tried, and that was no accident. And of course, other military operations in recent years, like the NATO-led campaign to protect Libyan citizens, wound up ultimately killing the leader of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi. So I think one part of Kim Jong-un's thinking is never be in a predictable location for any more than necessary. And I don't know to what extent military paranoia or concern about these sorts of scenarios is paramount in his mind. He probably knows it's a pretty unlikely thing that we would just do this out of the blue, but he also doesn't really know everything about who's in different positions of military leadership, who might just decide to fire in an unauthorized way. I'm not saying that would happen, but I'm saying from Kim Jong-un's perspective, being perhaps a very paranoid person and knowing about these war plans, he may just decide to avoid the kind of predictable public appearances that we've often seen from North Korean leaders in the past. Now, he doesn't do this. Obviously, sometimes he does show up. And so he doesn't push this argument too far, but I think he wants a certain amount of unpredictability. And he may also just be nervous about catching COVID himself or something like that. So a lot of things could go into this behavior.
But probably right now for the DPRK, the most thing that they want is the lifting of sanctions. He pushed South Korea to help them do that. He pushed the United States to lift their sanctions, but it doesn't go anywhere. What else do North Koreans have on the table to move in that direction?
Well, I think as you were discussing earlier with my colleague, one possibility is certainly that Kim could consider resuming the sorts of tests that he conducted through 2017. That would obviously be very provocative, and it would deny President Trump any ability to claim progress in the U.S. DPRK relationship. but it still is a possibility. You also could imagine Kim just waiting, for a few more months. Not that a Democrat in the United States would necessarily be much easier to negotiate with, but it would be different. And, we don't really know how a President Biden would approach North Korea at this juncture. We do know that President Obama, when he left office, acknowledged that his previous North Korea policy had not worked. So certainly we could imagine that a President Biden would take a fresh look, and he probably would not want to resume the kind of presidential diplomacy, person-to-person diplomacy that characterized Trump and Kim Jong-un's relationship. But he might be willing to consider a more two-step kind of negotiating strategy where you don't immediately try to eliminate all of the North Korean nuclear arsenal in the very first round of compromise. So that's one more strategy that Kim Jong-un could attempt.
And do you think that is more desirable for Pyongyang?
Well, I think the Trump administration has gotten itself tied in knots on North Korea policy. And in fairness to President Trump, he's not the first one in either the White House or the Blue House. But I think, President Trump's idea of reaching out to Kim Jong-un, thinking about the so-called art of the deal, trying to use personal diplomacy to create the conditions for compromise, all of that has more or less run into a wall. And perhaps it could be revived, but it's not going anywhere right now. It seems that the Trump administration, despite the differences with John Bolton and President Trump, I think Trump basically agrees with Bolton that you have to completely denuclearize North Korea in the first deal. And that's not going to happen. So we're stuck. So therefore, I don't see any particular promise in a Trump-Kim relationship going forward unless something changes dramatically.
You mentioned Bolton. The official DPRK statement comes after former U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton hinted at a surprise October push from Trump to meet with Kim. Is that just speculation on Bolton's part, or could such a move be a possibility?
Well, I think it's unlikely because, frankly, it's not clear what they could accomplish in October. And at this point, it wouldn't even really have that much interest because it's already happened 3 times. And, each meeting that the two leaders had was less interesting than the one before. Singapore, Vietnam, and then the DMZ. Each time there was less hope after the meeting than there had been before the meeting.
Could it be that Pyongyang come up with a major strategy shift?
Yes. I think there is a deal to be done here, which is to eliminate North Korea's nuclear production infrastructure while allowing it to keep its existing arsenal of warheads for a time. And in exchange for that, we have a partial, but not a complete, lifting of sanctions. That, to me, is the natural compromise. But it's, that's been available for the last 2 years, and no one's made any headway at moving forward on that deal. And right now, Americans aren't even talking about North Korea. So I don't know why this kind of October surprise would be appealing to President Trump, because it's not as if the North Korea issue is really either hurting him or potentially helping him. It's just not even on people's radar screens in the United States for the most part. So I don't think John Bolton's right about this one.
And China obviously wants to play a major role in stabilizing the situation. What do you think China can do in terms of deteriorating relations with the U.S. and very much uncertain relations with Pyongyang?
Well, I think the best strategy would be, first of all, for China and the United States to just start talking about Korea more. As you know, historically, China hasn't wanted to have those conversations because it's seen as somehow abandoning its North Korean ally. But I think the basic idea of thinking about how economic reform can gradually lead to more political reform, or at least certain changes, is a big idea that China could push, which China has itself exemplified. Vietnam has exemplified that. I also think China should be talking about this kind of a compromise proposal, where, again, North Korea would have to verifiably dismantle all of its nuclear production capability.
I have to cut you short there. Thank you very much. We're running out of time.
Fine.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jack. You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Joe in Beijing. Goodbye.